Did Anne Boleyn truly have a choice? Or was she ultimately compelled to surrender to the advances of King Henry VIII? Was she herself a tragic victim of the man who, during these years, began to reveal his tyrannical nature ever more openly? Or did she willingly take part in a dangerous game played for the highest possible stakes? These are some of the great questions surrounding the second wife of the notorious Tudor monarch. One thing is certain: Anne polarized opinion, both in her own lifetime and ever since. Eustace Chapuis, the Habsburg ambassador to the English court, referred to Anne as a concubine, and at times resorted to even harsher descriptions. In modern times, we still encounter words like adulteress used to characterize the queen. Authors such as Alison Weir counter this view with a portrayal of Anne as a skillful practitioner of courtly love. Others, by contrast, see her as a victim who struggled with all her strength to resist the king's pursuit, yet was ultimately forced to yield to his power. So what is the truth? The answer: everything and nothing. Welcome back to Lemmy History. I came across this topic on social media, and only then did I realize that I hadn't yet treated it in a video. So it's time to close that gap. Unfortunately, Anne herself offers little help in answering the question of whether she could have permanently rejected Henry. Only one letter, said to have been written by her to the king, has survived, and even that document's authenticity is uncertain. It is allegedly a letter penned in the Tower just 2 weeks before her execution. Only one passage within it offers any clue relevant to our question. "You have chosen me from a humble position to be your queen and companion, far beyond my merit or desire." The key words here are "far beyond my desire." If Anne indeed wrote the letter, she acknowledges her husband as responsible for her elevation, yet she does not claim that it occurred against her will. George Wyatt, writing during the reign of Anne's daughter, Elizabeth I, attributed to the Queen the assertion that she had rejected Henry several times during his courtship, unable to comprehend how he could maintain hope. Wyatt's account formed a central element in the Protestant effort to shape Anne's image as a martyr. Still, he was not entirely mistaken. We know from Henry's surviving letters that Anne refused to become his mistress, even within the conventions of courtly love. She did, in fact, reject him. Yet at some point, she yielded to his advances. These contradictions reveal that we must first take a closer look at what the word choice truly means in this context. After all, in theory, it is beyond dispute that Anne could have escaped from Henry. In the most extreme sense, she could have taken the one path he could not have followed her upon, a course I cannot name plainly here due to YouTube guidelines. When we ask whether Anne truly had a choice, what we are really questioning is whether she could have refused the monarch without suffering comparable consequences. Without some degree of loss, such defiance was certainly impossible. Henry would undoubtedly have reacted with anger and resentment. But would Anne's very existence have been endangered by such a refusal? Could she have resisted the king without destroying the political, economic, and social foundations of her life? This is the essence of what I mean by the illusion of free choice, as mentioned in the title of this video. If one of the available options threatens or ultimately destroys one's own existence, then it cannot truly be called a free choice. We have another word for that: blackmail. One question that has so far been neglected in these reflections is this: was it even a question for Anne at all? After all, she may never have intended to reject the king permanently. She might neither have wished nor needed to test the limits of her freedom of action. This idea closely aligns with the image of Anne as a manipulative strategist who pursued a deliberate, long-term plan. Indeed, there are arguments supporting this view that go beyond the simple fact that we know she ultimately became queen. Anne made certain independent choices in her dealings with Henry, decisions that did not alter the nature of their relationship as a whole, yet still carried significant risk. For instance, she introduced the monarch to anti-papal writings. Once she became queen, Anne acted with growing independence. In doing so, she alienated her powerful relative John Howard. The Duke of Norfolk would later refer to her as the Great Whore. The relationship between the uncle and his royal niece was, without question, severely strained. As queen, Anne evidently considered herself free from obligations of obedience toward her family, a view not shared by the men of her clan. Judging by the fact that it was Howard who ultimately announced her death sentence, they were the ones who prevailed. The difficulty lies in reconciling the image of Anne as a calculating strategist with the fact that she withdrew from court and wished to marry Henry Percy. To resolve this contradiction, one must assume that Anne believed she could thereby make the king more submissive, that, put bluntly, the longer she withheld herself from him, the greater his desire would grow. YouTuber and author Claire Ridgway has offered a pointed counterargument. Anne could not possibly have known this. Henry began his formal courtship in the summer of 1527, after deciding to petition the Pope for an annulment of his marriage. At that point, Anne withdrew from court and returned to her family's residence at Hever. It was far less likely that this move would inspire the monarch to make her his wife than that it would drive him to seek an easier conquest. Anyone who claims Anne was pursuing a long-term plan must concede that she was taking a considerable risk at that moment. After all, the Boleyns knew well that Henry's interest in women could fade quickly. Anne's sister Mary had been the king's mistress until he no longer desired her. The pendulum of interpretation has, in many respects, swung to the opposite extreme. This shift is due in no small part to the influential biography of the Queen written by Eric Ives. The author's sympathies clearly lay with Anne, and from his work, the victim narrative took shape. According to this view, Anne attempted to escape the king's advances once he resolved to leave Catherine of Aragon. Yet her power-hungry family, together with the king maddened by passion, ultimately forced her return to court. Her relatives made it plain that she would not be permitted to withdraw again. The family's standing, they insisted, depended upon her. Anne had been raised from childhood to marry advantageously and thereby advance her family's fortunes. Modern sensibilities are often applied to her retrospectively. She is portrayed as a woman driven back into the grasp of the man who harassed her. While this interpretation aligns with contemporary values, it does not fully reflect the mindset of the 16th century. Within the victim narrative, it is Henry who relentlessly pursues the one woman who dared to refuse him. It is for this reason, we are told, that he had Anne's engagement to Henry Percy annulled through Cardinal Wolsey's intervention. During this period, the king wrote her letters such as the following: "I have thrown myself into great uneasiness by consulting myself on the contents of your letters, because I do not know how to interpret them, to my detriment, as it seems in some places, or to my advantage, as I understand them in others. I ask you with all my heart to tell me expressly what in your whole mind stands about the love between the two of us. For I must necessarily be certain of this answer, since I have now been struck by the arrow of love for more than a whole year, without knowing whether I will fail or whether a place has been prepared for me in your heart and in your true affection." This last point has for some time prevented me from calling you my mistress. For if you love me in no other way than with ordinary affection, you are in no way entitled to that name, as it signifies a special love that goes far beyond the common. But if it pleases you to render me the office of a true and faithful lover and friend, and to give yourself to me, heart, body, and soul, to me, who has been and will be your very faithful servant, I promise you that not only shall that name be given to you, but that I will also take you as my only mistress, rejecting all others from thought and feeling, in order to serve you alone. I implore you to give me an unequivocal answer to this simple letter of mine, as to how far and in what I may place confidence. Written by the hand of one who would like to remain yours. We do not know how Anne received this letter, yet her family may well have recognized in it a new opportunity. Within the victim narrative, the Queen sought to use her rising influence to free herself at last from the harsh pressures imposed by her father, brother, and uncle. The limitation of this interpretation, however, lies in the fact that Anne did not have to seek marriage. She could have accepted the role of royal mistress, which was in fact what Henry desired and what her family expected. Yet she herself resisted this arrangement for a long time. In doing so, she went further than prudence might have advised. Perhaps this too was a calculated strategy, an attempt to discourage the king's pursuit without provoking consequences that might endanger her very existence. A counter-argument to the idea that Anne's refusal was merely an escape strategy is that the consequences of saying no could hardly have been worse than what ultimately befell her. Her resistance, therefore, must have been deliberate, a calculated strategy. Yet this brings us back to a crucial point. She could not possibly have foreseen the outcome. There was no way to predict that her relationship with the king would cost her, her brother, and several other men their lives. In hindsight, the damage would undoubtedly have been far less severe had Anne rejected Henry permanently at an early stage. But the fact that her fate continues to fascinate us so powerfully underscores how utterly unprecedented those events were. To put it somewhat irreverently, and certainly not in the most historical terms, Anne was accused of witchcraft and rumored to have had 6 fingers on one hand. Yet no one ever credited her with the gift of prophecy. Her tragic end, therefore, cannot be taken as a meaningful measure of the choices available to her while she still lived. Another modern argument against viewing Anne as a victim concerns her relationship with Catherine of Aragon in several respects. First, Anne might have invoked her loyalty to the Queen. After all, she was deeply indebted to Catherine, having served her faithfully as a lady-in-waiting. To betray her would have meant committing adultery, and not merely adultery, but that of her own queen. However, Henry was a higher authority than Catherine. Anne owed a greater allegiance to the king than to the queen, particularly once he came to regard his marriage as invalid. These points might be dismissed as convenient justifications, yet the more significant fact is that Anne actually attempted to use this very reasoning. She rejected Henry by pointing out that he was already married. The consequence of this was that the king set in motion the process of annulling his marriage. In doing so, Anne found herself ensnared by her own strategy. She had refused Henry on the grounds of his union with Catherine, and now he was determined to eliminate that obstacle entirely. Another counter-argument against the portrayal of Anne as a victim concerns the question of religion. In theory, the Catholic Church stood as the supreme moral authority. The Pope had refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, and at that point, Anne could well have ended her relationship with the king by appealing to her duty to God. Instead, she married him, thereby making him a bigamist. The crucial point, however, is that Anne did not regard the Pope or the Roman Church as the ultimate moral authority. She was staunchly anti-papal. It was she who persuaded Henry that he must sever ties with Rome. Anne supported the idea of the king becoming the supreme religious authority in England. Once he sanctioned the dissolution of his first marriage, he was ready to marry her. At that stage, Anne had no religious grounds on which to resist Henry, at least not from her own theological perspective. The situation might have been different if she had permanently separated from Henry after Catherine's refusal to agree to the annulment. But even then, such a stance would have relied on acknowledging an authority, that of Rome, to which Anne herself did not feel bound. When it comes to the question of familial pressure, the situation becomes considerably more complex. Some have suggested that Anne could have fled and married in secret to escape the king's pursuit. Yet this would have required a man bold enough to defy the monarch, and even then, there was no guarantee that Henry would have abandoned his claim. It is impossible to determine precisely how much the Boleyn family would have lost had the king turned against them in anger at Anne's rejection. Presumably, all the privileges and advantages Henry had bestowed upon the Boleyns and their relatives during his courtship would have been jeopardized. The king was the central source of economic, social, and political advancement. To incur his wrath would likely have brought lasting hardship upon the entire family. Anne herself was entirely dependent on her family before her marriage. She had no independent economic foundation. Had she disowned her relatives out of frustration, she would have been left destitute. Anne clearly recognized this vulnerability. We can see it in her insistence on securing her own income during her relationship with the king, thereby establishing a degree of independence. We cannot know for certain how her family would have reacted had Anne permanently refused the king and broken off the relationship. Yet the sources make it abundantly clear that she was subjected to enormous pressure from her kin, pressure that significantly limited the freedom of any choice she might have had. Jane Seymour is often cited as a counterexample to the claim that Anne could not have said no to the king. Henry's third wife famously interceded on behalf of the Catholics and his daughter Mary, but then the monarch warned her against it by invoking Anne's fate. Jane knew perfectly well what had happened to her predecessor, and yet she spoke out. Apart from a very unpleasant exchange with her husband, however, nothing came of it. But this comparison is problematic for several reasons. First, both Anne and Catherine were dead. There was no longer any question regarding the legitimacy of Henry's marriage to Jane. Second, the king's third wife was not defying Henry for her own sake. She was pleading on behalf of others. Third, the right to petition the king for mercy had long been a traditional prerogative of the queen. In her intercession, Jane was acting not as an independent individual, but in her official role as queen. What was unusual was not her action, but Henry's harsh reaction to it. For Jane, the accusations that had led to Anne's execution were a grim reality. She probably did not understand at first that Henry expected absolute submission and passivity from his wife. It was likely only when he pointedly reminded her of her predecessor that Jane recognized Anne's fate as a personal warning. So what does all of this reveal about Anne's actual scope of action? As we have seen, she was able to withdraw from court for a time before marrying Henry, but not permanently. She was able to influence the nature of their relationship to some extent, yet powerful forces from both her family and the king himself ultimately drove her into his arms. Anne could only assert herself against her family with the king's support. Against Henry, however, she would have needed the backing of her family, and that she did not have. Over time, her ability to refuse the king diminished steadily. She tried various strategies to resist or delay him, but these were successively undermined, either by Henry's persistence or by her family's ambitions. My sobering conclusion is this: the moment Henry sought to make Anne his mistress, she no longer had a choice that would not have endangered her very existence. She could, perhaps, have accepted this role. Yet whether out of ambition for more, or in the hope that the king's passion would fade, Anne refused. That decision marked the point of no return. Henry changed so profoundly, politically, religiously, and personally, for her sake, that Anne's survival became inseparable from his continued favor. The instant he withdrew his protection, her fate was sealed. Anne Boleyn was among the victims of Henry VIII. In hindsight, it is easy to suggest that she should have agreed to be his mistress, or to condemn her for adultery, while forgetting that such a relationship always involves two people, and that the husband bears the greater share of blame. It is unreasonable to expect that Anne could have foreseen that her relationship with the king would spiral into a catastrophe that would claim her life and those of several others. Henry VIII was, in truth, a narcissistic psychopath. To place the blame for his decisions upon anyone but this monstrous man is deeply unjust. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.